When you hear the name Tony Robbins, what comes to mind? I bet it's something like, oh yeah, that self-help guy.
He's definitely a household name.
Totally. But here's the thing, there's this interesting contrast with him. He's insanely successful, but also surrounded by controversy.
Right. It's not all sunshine and rainbows with him.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we're really digging into Tony Robbins, the man, the message, the controversies, the whole 9 yards.
Sounds fascinating.
It really is. And we have you to thank for this one. This deep dive was a listener request. So thanks for sending that in. Okay, so we're going beyond just the surface level here. We really want to unpack who Tony Robbins is beyond just the motivational speaker persona.
And that's what makes it so interesting, right? I mean, he's undeniably a huge figure in the self-help world, but there's always been this debate surrounding his work.
Absolutely. And the video you shared really dives into that, like from his journey to becoming a self-help icon to some of the criticisms around him. And one of the first things that jumped out at me was his background. I mean, talk about a storybook rise. He goes from working as a janitor at 17 to building this multi-million-dollar empire around self-improvement. It's wild.
It's a classic rags to riches story.
Totally. And it makes you wonder, did his own experiences growing up shape his whole approach to self-help?
Oh, absolutely. The video talks about his childhood being pretty tough. Actually, a lot of instability, lots of challenges. So it makes sense that overcoming those kinds of obstacles would become central to his teachings.
Yeah, he's essentially living proof of his own message, right?
Exactly. He's saying, look, I came from nothing, and if I can turn my life around, you can too.
And that's powerful stuff, especially for people who feel stuck.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. But how does someone go from a difficult upbringing to becoming Tony Robbins, this self-help phenomenon?
Right. How does that transformation even happen?
Yeah. The video mentioned he was already giving seminars as a teenager.
It's true. Even in his early 20s, he was drawing crowds, making a name for himself. And this is where things get really interesting because he starts incorporating these techniques like neuro-linguistic programming or NLP into his seminars.
NLP. Okay, so I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not going to lie, I couldn't really explain it. What is that?
So imagine this. You stub your toe and say, ugh, this day is ruined. That's your language actually shaping how you feel.
Oh, interesting.
NLP is all about understanding how our thoughts, our beliefs, but especially our language patterns, affect our behavior, even our experiences.
So it's not just about thinking positive, it's about changing how you talk to yourself.
Exactly. Robbins uses these NLP techniques to help people, kind of rewire their thinking to replace limiting beliefs with more empowering ones.
That's actually pretty cool. But how does that play out in his seminars specifically?
Well, that's where things get really intense, especially with something like his Unleash the Power Within seminar.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
You've got thousands of people, high energy, and of course the firewalk.
I was wondering when we'd get to that. Firewalking, is that like a metaphor, a team building thing, or what?
It's kind of all of those things rolled into one, really.
Yeah.
The firewalk becomes this very visceral experience, It's about facing your fears head on.
Proving you're capable of more than you think you are.
Exactly.
I can see that. But there's always been this debate about whether his methods are legit or just really good showmanship. What do you think?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
Some people come out of those seminars feeling like they've had this life-changing experience. Others, not so much.
So it depends on the person.
To a large degree, yes. It probably depends on their mindset going in, what they're hoping to get out of it.
Makes sense. So we've got this larger-than-life figure, right? Went from a tough background to building this whole empire around self-improvement, and he's using these, unconventional techniques to do it. But then there's the other side of the coin, the controversies.
Right. We can't ignore those.
Exactly. And the video touches on some pretty serious allegations against Robbins. So do those allegations contradict the image he projects of, empowerment and self-mastery?
They're definitely a shadow over his legacy.
Yeah, and we're talking about those allegations of sexual misconduct that came out in 2019.
Right, those are big news.
Huge. And I remember thinking, whoa, this doesn't really line up with the whole Tony Robbins image.
It was definitely a disconnect for a lot of people.
For sure. And the video touched on that too, how those allegations clash with his whole message of empowerment.
It's a valid point, and it's important to remember those allegations are just that, allegations.
Right, he's denied them, and they haven't been proven in court.
Exactly. But even so, those accusations definitely made people take a second look at his methods. Like, could those intense environments be misconstrued?
That's a really good point. And it probably made a lot of people rethink their own experiences with his work.
Absolutely. It brings up a lot of questions about power dynamics, consent, especially in these settings where there's this charismatic figure.
It's a complicated issue for sure.
It really is.
And it's interesting because the video also highlights all this philanthropy Robbins is involved in. Like, he's donated millions to charity, helped feed people in need.
Yeah, he's got a huge philanthropic side.
So how do you reconcile that with these serious allegations?
It's a question a lot of people have.
Mm-hmm.
Some see it as a contradiction,
Yeah.
Like, his seminars are expensive, but then he's giving away all this money. It's like, which one is it?
Right. Is it generosity or is it just like good PR?
Exactly. But then others say, hey, maybe his business model allows him to do more good.
So there's no easy answer.
Not really. It's up to each person to decide what they think.
That's fair. Okay, so we've got these controversies, this philanthropy, but there's also this whole other side to Tony Robbins that really surprised me. Like, did you know this guy can supposedly lift cars with his legs?
I did hear that.
And he reads, like, a book a day.
Yeah, he's got some pretty unusual hobbies.
Totally. So it's like, how does all that fit in with the self-help guru image?
Well, I think it actually connects back to his core message. The physical feats, it's all about pushing boundaries.
So it's still about self-improvement, just in a different way.
Exactly. He's constantly challenging himself, trying to become a better version of himself.
I can respect that. But what about the criticisms of his methods? Like, are those legit?
I mean, there's definitely some validity to them.
Mm-hmm.
Some people say his methods are kind of like one size fits all, They lack that personal touch.
So what works for one person might not work for another?
Right. And they say his approach doesn't always take that into account.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like, just because you change how you talk to yourself, like with NLP, it doesn't magically solve all your problems.
Exactly. Real change takes more than that.
Right. You got to get to the root of the issue.
Exactly. And some people say Robbins' methods are good for a quick boost, but not lasting change.
Interesting. It's like that saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime.
That's a great analogy.
Robbins might be great at giving you that fish, but does he teach you how to fish?
That's the question. But to be fair, Robbins does talk about the importance of ongoing work,
Right. He always says you have to put in the effort.
Exactly. It's not a magic solution.
True. Okay, so where does that leave us with Tony Robbins? We've covered a lot. His background, his methods, the controversy, even his love of lifting cars. What's the takeaway here?
I think it's that Tony Robbins is complicated. He's not just some self-help guy. He's had a huge impact.
For sure. And he's given us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Whether you love him or hate him, he makes you question things. Like, what is success? How much power does our mind really have? It's fascinating.
Totally. Well, on that note, we'll let our listeners ponder all that. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Tony Robbins.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a wild ride.